When the world stops fearing America, why a mocked Trump becomes more dangerous. What happens when the world stops fearing a superpower, not when it loses its army, not when it loses its economy, but when it loses its reputation, because history shows something uncomfortable. The most dangerous moment in geopolitics is often when a leader believes he is being laughed at, and right now, Donald Trump may be facing exactly that moment. Donald Trump has long governed according to a simple, strategic instinct often misattributed as cynicism but better understood as hierarchy. Power belongs to those who can compel obedience. At home, this instinct has worked. Abroad, it has not. The resulting mismatch, domestic fear paired with international ridicule, creates a presidency that is not merely erratic, but structurally prone to escalation. A leader who cannot command respect externally yet depends on intimidation internally does not moderate. He compensates. And compensation, in geopolitics, rarely arrives quietly. The danger is not that Trump is feared. It is that he is no longer feared where it matters most: fear at home, theater abroad, inside the United States. Trump's governing method has been unmistakably coercive rather than consensual. Institutions have adapted not by resisting him consistently, but by anticipating him. Corporations hedge against his displeasure. Universities adjust language before confrontation begins. Party officials align themselves with his narratives before verifying their plausibility. This is not loyalty in the traditional ideological sense. It is risk management. Fear works domestically because proximity matters. Trump can punish regulators, litigants, donors, media outlets, and political rivals directly. He controls appointments, investigations, access, and legitimacy signals. Even when formal authority is limited, informal leverage remains potent. International politics offers no such advantage. Foreign leaders do not depend on presidential favor for survival. They depend on their own voters, elites, militaries, and economic coalitions. They may flatter Washington, but they rarely fear it unless coercive capacity appears credible and durable. Trump's authority abroad therefore rests not on intimidation, but on perception. And perception, increasingly, has shifted from unpredictability to unseriousness. That distinction is decisive. The collapse of strategic awe. For decades, American presidents benefited from a structural inheritance, the assumption that the United States could act decisively, persistently, and coherently. Even when Washington blundered, as in Vietnam or Iraq, its intentions were still interpreted as consequential. Trump's diplomacy replaced that expectation with improvisation, transactionalism, personal flattery, public reversals, and theatrical symmetry altered how allies and adversaries calculated American commitments. Leaders learned that symbolic gestures could substitute for concessions. Praise could substitute for compliance. Optics could substitute for outcomes. This produced a peculiar diplomatic equilibrium sometimes described informally by foreign officials as managing Trump. The objective was not persuasion. It was calibration: offer symbolic wins, avoid public confrontation, wait for policy reversals. The result was not fear. It was choreography. Once foreign governments begin treating a superpower's leader as a negotiable variable rather than a structural constraint, deterrence erodes quietly but decisively. The presidency becomes something to navigate rather than something to obey, and ridicule, in international politics, is rarely harmless. It is a signal that expectations of retaliation have diminished. When reputation stops doing the work of power, superpowers rely less on force than on reputation for force. Credibility allows threats to function without deployment. It reduces the need for escalation. It stabilizes alliances. A leader widely seen as manipulable weakens that reputational economy. If adversaries believe flattery can redirect policy, they test boundaries. If allies believe commitments depend on personal chemistry, they hedge. If both suspect domestic instability will shorten policy lifespans, they delay cooperation. In such an environment, the presidency loses its traditional multiplier effect. Statements no longer move markets reliably. Warnings no longer shape battlefield expectations. Promises no longer anchor coalition strategy. Instead, each decision must be demonstrated rather than assumed. Demonstration invites escalation. The paradox of the strongman without an audience. Trump's political strength rests partly on projecting dominance. But dominance requires recognition. A strongman ignored abroad faces a legitimacy deficit he cannot easily correct. Domestic audiences accustomed to rhetoric of control expect visible victories, concessions extracted, enemies humiliated, allies disciplined. When those victories fail to materialize, pressure accumulates, not from critics, but from supporters. The logic becomes circular: if fear produces compliance, and compliance proves fear exists, then lack of compliance proves fear has disappeared. A leader operating inside that logic must restore the missing element. Historically, such restoration often takes dramatic form. Why ridicule produces risk-taking. Leaders who believe they are underestimated behave differently from leaders who believe they are constrained. Underestimation invites theatrical correction. The temptation is especially strong when domestic authority remains intact, international credibility declines, elections threaten future leverage, adversaries test boundaries simultaneously. Under those conditions, escalation appears rational rather than reckless. It promises reputational repair at relatively low domestic cost. It transforms weakness into spectacle. It replaces negotiation with demonstration. Military confrontation, punitive strikes, or abrupt diplomatic ruptures become tools not merely of policy but of image reconstruction. The objective shifts from solving crises to redefining perception. Iran as the test case of compensatory power. Few arenas illustrate this dynamic more clearly than confrontation with Iran. Unlike smaller adversaries, Iran cannot be coerced symbolically. It requires either sustained negotiation or credible escalation capacity. Performative pressure alone produces stalemate. If Washington cannot extract concessions yet cannot accept compromise, the leadership dilemma becomes acute. A negotiated settlement risks appearing weak. A prolonged standoff risks appearing ineffective. Only dramatic action restores narrative control. That is precisely the moment when symbolic force becomes attractive, not because it changes the strategic balance, but because it changes the psychological one. A strike does not need to win a war. It only needs to restore fear. The misreading of laughter. Observers often assume ridicule reduces danger. In domestic politics this can be true. Mockery delegitimizes authority and weakens charisma. In international politics the opposite frequently holds. A leader who believes he is mocked is not neutralized. He is incentivized. Reputation becomes a battlefield. Status becomes a strategic objective. Escalation becomes communicative rather than operational. The risk is not irrationality. It is rational overcorrection. The structural trap of the second-term presidency. Second-term presidents historically operate with fewer constraints but also fewer guarantees. Allies anticipate policy discontinuity. Adversaries anticipate electoral turnover. Bureaucracies anticipate legacy-driven decisions. When international credibility is already fragile, these expectations intensify. Foreign governments begin waiting out the presidency rather than negotiating with it. They calculate timelines instead of compromises. They absorb pressure rather than responding to it. This creates the most dangerous environment for coercive diplomacy, one in which threats must be acted upon to remain believable, and once threats must be acted upon, escalation becomes procedural rather than exceptional, a superpower that needs to be feared again. The central strategic problem is not that Trump seeks fear. Many presidents have. The problem is that fear cannot be manufactured theatrically. Once credibility declines, it must be demonstrated materially. If allies flatter rather than comply, and adversaries probe rather than retreat, the presidency faces a narrowing set of options. Accept diminished influence, or attempt to restore it visibly. History suggests leaders rarely choose the former voluntarily. Which is why ridicule, far from neutralizing risk, can sharpen it. A superpower that feels laughed at does not retreat into modesty. It reaches for proof, and proof, in geopolitics, is rarely subtle.